Cop refuses to let a black woman enter court. Then a Secret Service agent arrives. I felt my heart pound so forcefully that I wondered if others could hear the drumming in my chest. Something about the tense hush in the courthouse lobby signaled that I was stepping onto a stage where every action mattered. Every look carried a weight, and every word could tip the scales of fate on that sweltering August morning. I didn't know that by nightfall, I would be witness to a moment so charged with conflict, heartbreak, unity, and triumph that would alter the way I viewed my city and maybe even my country forever. If only I had known, I might have braced myself for the abrupt confrontation with an officer of the law whose presence exuded an unsettling air of authority and prejudice. I might have found different words, or stood in a different spot, or perhaps done anything to avoid the sense that the world around me was on the brink of an explosion. It all began with a simple plan. I was there as a local journalist, assigned to cover a contentious civil rights case. The plaintiff was a small nonprofit, but they were going up against major city officials for an alleged violation of constitutional liberties. Rumors swirled about shocking evidence that might surface. Reporters from bigger outlets hovered, waiting for the story that might catapult them to primetime segments or front-page columns. Cameras were rolling. Microphones were set up in the hallway. Everyone seemed on edge. Then I noticed her, standing in a quiet corner near the doors that led to the main courtroom. She was young, or at least she appeared youthful, though there was a resolute determination in her eyes that suggested deeper wisdom. She wore a crisp blazer and carried a worn leather satchel over her shoulder, which might contain files or personal documents. The nameplate attached to the satchel read, A. Robinson, but I wouldn't learn until later that her first name was Althea. She took a shaky breath, as if mentally preparing herself for something significant. Little did anyone suspect that in just a few minutes, she'd be at the center of a dramatic confrontation that would have every spectator in the courthouse frozen in a combination of shock and disbelief. The tension began to build the moment a police officer, Sergeant Dean Caraway, as his uniform tag declared, raised his hand in front of Althea with an air of indifference. He placed his body between her and the door, a silent blockade that said more than words ever could. You shall not pass. At first, I assumed it was a routine security check. Maybe that Althea had forgotten to show identification or something equally minor. But something about Sergeant Caraway's stance gave me pause. He was tall, nearly 6 feet, with a thick build that seemed to tower over her. His arms were crossed in front of his chest, and though he looked calm, there was an unmistakable chill in the set of his jaw and the narrowness of his eyes. People often say that body language can betray our hidden biases. In that moment, it felt like his entire posture exuded a hostility that was specifically directed at her. Althea offered a polite smile and spoke quietly, in a voice so composed it nearly concealed her frustration. I'm here to attend today's hearing. May I go in? Caraway didn't uncross his arms. Instead, he regarded her with a skeptical glower. Your ID. Althea dug into her satchel, her hands rummaging through a couple of folders. She retrieved a small, worn-out wallet and pulled out a driver's license. The moment she held it out, Caraway's expression hardened further, as if the sight of her name or her face on that ID was reason enough to doubt its legitimacy. He took too long scrutinizing it, flipping it over, comparing the picture to her face. It was reminiscent of those tense airport lines where a suspicious security agent seizes on some tiny detail to justify an overreach of authority. I edged closer to the scene, curiosity on high alert. Other bystanders, including attorneys, visitors, and even a few staff members, sensed a standoff. A hush fell over the hallway. With so many eyes on them, Caraway's stance only grew more rigid. Finally, he handed back the ID, but instead of stepping aside, he barked, "This doesn't look like you." For a second, I thought Althea's composure might crack. Her eyebrows twitched, her mouth fell open. That ID photo was clearly her, albeit from a few years back. If anything, the only difference was that her hair was shorter in the photo. "It is me," she answered carefully, as though trying to keep her voice steady for fear of further escalating tensions. "Is there a problem?" The stare Caraway gave her lasted an eternity. He was searching for something, an excuse, a slip of the tongue, anything that might justify denying her entry. His silence itself was a loaded accusation. Meanwhile, the rest of the lobby stood transfixed. We could sense that this was more than a bureaucratic delay. It stank of profiling, a raw, uncomfortable demonstration of bias. "You can't enter right now," he finally said, offering no explanation, no rationale. Althea took a breath. "Officer, I have the right to be here. I'm attending the hearing on behalf of—" He cut her off. "I decide who goes in and who doesn't." She glanced around for support, and for a moment, her gaze flicked over to me. Our eyes met, and I sensed her internal plea for help, for a witness, at least. Gathering my nerve, I stepped forward, pressing the record button on my phone. "Excuse me, officer," I began. "Is there an issue with her ID or her permission to enter?" Carraway shifted his attention to me. The temperature in that hallway seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "You got business here?" he demanded. "I'm a reporter," I said, mustering a firm tone. "I'm covering the trial. This lady appears to have valid identification." I gestured at Althea. "If you can enter the name into your system, that should resolve." He silenced me with a glare. "Ma'am," he addressed me with forced politeness, "I suggest you mind your own business." Yet, minding my own business had never been my strong suit, especially not when I witnessed what felt like an injustice. The tension was rapidly escalating when another officer, a younger man with wide, uncertain eyes, approached. He whispered something to Carraway, presumably cautioning him that this was attracting too much attention. Carraway's jaw twitched. For a fraction of a moment, he looked like he might step aside, but instead he tightened his stance. "I'm just doing my job," he said, still glaring at Althea. And then, in a voice that managed to carry calm authority laced with an icy threat, Althea stated her purpose. "I'm due to testify in the hearing for the Jefferson Initiative lawsuit. I'm a legal researcher. I'm not here as a bystander. I'm here on the case. You are obstructing justice if you refuse me entry." Her words caused a collective intake of breath from everyone present. If she truly had a formal role in the proceedings, Carraway's refusal was more than a matter of inconvenience or rudeness. It was potentially illegal. The thunderous hush fell again. Carraway took a step forward, gesturing for Althea to move back. She didn't budge. She held her ground. The intensity of the moment felt as if it could ignite into an explosive confrontation with the slightest spark. That's when the hush in the hallway was broken by the echo of footsteps, firm, methodical footsteps, the kind that belong to someone who knows exactly where they're going and why. Heads turned. A man in a meticulously tailored suit emerged from around the corner. He wore a subtle pin on his lapel. I squinted to read it. The shape was unmistakable. The crest of the United States Secret Service. In an instant, the atmosphere changed. He was tall, perhaps an inch or two taller than Carraway, and his presence commanded attention in a way that was oddly serene yet undeniably authoritative. His hair, trimmed close on the sides, hinted at years of discipline and perhaps military background. He made eye contact with no one until he finally stopped a few feet from Carraway and Althea. "I'll need you to step aside," he said quietly, addressing the officer. Carraway blinked in confusion, as if struggling to piece together why a federal agent would involve himself in what he considered local business. "And who might you be?" he shot back, though less confidently than before. The man reached into his jacket pocket and displayed his credentials, an official ID with the Secret Service emblem. "Special Agent Daniel Price," he answered. There was no arrogance in his tone, just a quiet certainty. "I'm here on official government business." Carraway's hostility wavered. You could almost see the gears turning in his mind. Did he dare challenge a Secret Service agent? Did he suspect that Althea was somehow connected to this man, or to something bigger than a mere hearing? It took him a moment, but Carraway slowly stepped aside, albeit with open reluctance. Althea exhaled sharply, as though she had been holding her breath. Her eyes met the agent's in silent gratitude. The murmur of the crowd swept through the hallway again, like a wave of relief tinged with excitement that something extraordinary might happen next. But it wasn't over. Carraway couldn't let this go without some last attempt to regain control. "Agent Price, what's your reason for being here?" he asked, sounding both defensive and curious. "We weren't informed of any Secret Service presence." Price regarded him coolly. "We don't always announce," he replied. but I can confirm that Ms. Robinson is expected inside." He nodded at Althea. "Ma'am, please proceed." The wave of astonishment that passed over Althea's face was brief, but telling. She clearly hadn't expected this turn of events, nor that a Secret Service agent would come to her immediate defense. That night, I would reflect on how life can take these extraordinary sudden loops, as though each twist is meticulously choreographed. I followed Althea and Price through the courthouse door, the corridor behind us still abuzz with whispered speculation. Once past security, Althea cast an uncertain glance at Price, as if she wanted to thank him, but also needed to confirm that everything happening was indeed real. He held the door for her. "Go on," he said gently. "The hearing should be starting soon." She nodded. "Thank you," she managed, her voice full of relief yet laced with subtle question. Why? Why is the Secret Service stepping in for me? I was desperate to find out, as was everyone else who had witnessed the standoff. But in that moment, the priority was to get Althea inside, so she wouldn't miss her testimony. I slipped in behind them, taking a seat among the scattered journalists and spectators. Carraway lingered in the doorway, frustration etched into his features. While it might have been a small victory, the tension hung in the air like a post-storm humidity, an uncomfortable reminder that any moment the clouds could gather again. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt no less charged. The judge, an older woman with a stony expression and a reputation for tolerance toward neither nonsense nor delays, was already on the bench. The lawyers for the Jefferson Initiative were seated at one table, while the city's legal team held the other. Rows of pew-like benches were dotted with observers, some there for professional reasons, others out of personal interest, and a few presumably just out of curiosity about a high-profile civil rights case. Althea made her way to the front, seating herself at the Jefferson Initiative's table, setting her satchel down with care. Agent Price vanished as inconspicuously as he'd arrived, taking a seat near the back. By all appearances, he was just another observer. No dramatic announcements, no grand displays of authority. Yet his very presence radiated an aura of watchfulness. I settled in a few rows behind him, notebook in hand, phone on silent, but still recording for my reference. My pulse was still humming from what had transpired in the hallway, and I couldn't help but wonder, was this the story I was meant to cover? Or was there something far more significant at play? The hearing began. The lead attorney for the Jefferson Initiative, a poised woman named Harriet Voss, stood up to make her opening statements. She painted a picture of systemic infractions, alleged wiretaps, withheld public records, intimidation tactics employed by city officials to stifle the nonprofit's advocacy. The audience was riveted. The city's defense attorney, a man with graying temples and a calculated manner of speech, countered that the claims were unfounded, relying on circumstantial evidence, and that the city had acted within its legal bounds to maintain order. At times, the arguments were so entangled in legal jargon that it was difficult to follow every detail. But tension spiked every time Harriet Voss mentioned the words constitutional violation or breach of due process, reminding everyone of the high stakes. About an hour into the proceedings, the moment arrived. Harriet glanced over at Althea and asked her to approach the witness stand. All eyes pivoted to the young researcher. She rose, her posture upright and expression unreadable, except for the faint determination flickering in her eyes. A bailiff administered the oath, and Althea swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Though her voice was steady, you could hear the emotional undercurrents in every word she spoke. Althea was no mere spectator. She had delved deep into public records, uncovered hidden documents, and interviewed numerous community members who had been affected by the city's alleged misconduct. She explained in meticulous detail how entire sets of records on police misconduct had vanished without official explanation, and how nonprofits that attempted to retrieve them were given runarounds or told the documents never existed. She spoke of the intimidation she herself had faced, unmarked cars idling outside her home late at night, anonymous emails warning her to back away from her research. As she spoke, a ripple of discomfort passed through the city's legal team. You could sense the shift in the courtroom, a collective realization that this wasn't merely a spat over technicalities. These were claims of deep-seated corruption, an accusation that the city was systematically suppressing critical information. When cross-examined, she remained calm, though the defense tried to poke holes in her story. Ms. Robinson, the city's attorney began, isn't it true that your research is entirely funded by an organization that opposes current city leadership? Althea blinked. No, the Jefferson Initiative is a registered nonprofit, funded by a variety of donors. Our research is in compliance with recognized standards of data verification. You never found reason to doubt your sources, or wonder if they provided you with fabricated records. Althea gave a slight shake of her head. Each source was vetted, and each document cross-referenced. Fabrications rarely stand up against thorough cross-checking. We only included data that could be verified. The attorney smirked, turning to the judge. No further questions at this time, Your Honor. But his dismissive manner failed to negate the fact that Althea's testimony landed with remarkable conviction. After she returned to her seat, the hearing proceeded with more witnesses, some telling stories of intimidation and fear, others offering data analyses, showing anomalies in city records. My attention, however, kept drifting back to Althea and her unexpected protector, Agent Price. Whenever recess was called, I'd notice him at the water fountain or near the hallway, maintaining a low profile, yet always positioned in a way that suggested vigilance. The day wore on. By late afternoon, the judge concluded the session, stating that arguments would resume the following day. People began gathering their belongings, stepping out into the corridors to rehash the day's developments. I found Althea near a row of vending machines, gathering her notes. Her composure remained, but her shoulders seemed to sag now that the formalities had ended. I approached carefully. "Ms. Robinson?" I asked, reintroducing myself as a local reporter. "I saw what happened earlier. Would you mind telling me your perspective?" She appeared hesitant, her eyes darting around. In that moment, Agent Price was nowhere to be seen. Likely he had left or was standing out of sight. Finally, Althea sighed and nodded. "Sure," she said, "but I can't reveal too many details about the case." "I understand," I replied. "I'm more interested in what happened with the officer, Caraway, and why it seems that a Secret Service agent is personally ensuring you can enter the courtroom." She drew in a slow breath. "Officer Caraway was just the latest. I've had these impediments for months now, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. As for Agent Price, I don't really know. I didn't ask for his help. He just showed up, though I wanted more details. I sensed she was uncomfortable, so I shifted the subject. Why do you think Caraway singled you out?" Althea pressed her lips together. "I can't speak to his personal motives, but I can say that I've never seen a white colleague get questioned over their ID or have to defend their right to attend a hearing. Not once." A wave of empathy and fury rolled through me. I recalled the slight quiver in her voice, the tension in her stance, the humiliating sense that the color of her skin had been enough to bar her from a public proceeding. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," I offered quietly. She gave me a grateful nod, though her eyes glistened with a mix of exhaustion and determination. Before we could speak further, her phone buzzed with an urgent call. She excused herself, stepping away to answer it. Just then, I spotted Agent Price at the far end of the hallway, speaking into his own phone in hushed tones. As he ended his call, I took a bold step forward to approach him. He noticed me and raised an eyebrow, but made no move to leave. "Agent Price," I began, trying to keep my voice respectful, but also direct. "I'm with the local paper. May I ask about your involvement here?" His face was unreadable. "I'm simply present to ensure that a witness of interest can exercise her right to testify without obstruction," he replied, which was about as vague an answer as one could get. "How did you know Ms. Robinson would be prevented from entering?" "I didn't," he said, then offered a small, enigmatic smile. "But I've learned to show up where I'm needed." My reporter instincts wanted to pry further, but his demeanor politely signaled that he wouldn't elaborate. Still, I couldn't resist one more question. "Are you implying that Ms. Robinson is under some form of federal protection?" Price maintained that measured composure. "Everyone in this country is entitled to fairness under the law," he answered. "Sometimes people need a little help making sure they receive it." Before I could press him more, he nodded in farewell and walked away. I watched him go, mystified by his presence. He was like a ghost with a badge, there and gone, leaving more questions in his wake than answers. In the week that followed, every day at the courthouse was an exercise in tension management. Journalists debated the possible outcomes of the lawsuit. City officials insisted they'd done nothing wrong, and the Jefferson Initiative's small but determined legal team held press conferences, refusing to be intimidated. Althea's research was scrutinized, dissected, and occasionally attacked as incomplete or misleading, though the more they tried to dismiss her, the more fiercely Harriet Voss defended the integrity of her work. Sergeant Carraway maintained his post at the courthouse entrance, perhaps to save face, or perhaps because someone higher up had insisted that he stay on duty. On the second day, I arrived early, worried that Althea might face more trouble. Indeed, he was there again, arms folded like a sentinel. But this time, Althea arrived with Harriet. Together, they breezed right past him without so much as a second glance. When I saw Carraway's face in that moment, it was twisted with something that resembled both anger and fear. His control over who entered the courthouse had clearly been undermined by the presence of that Secret Service agent, by the glare of the media, by the simple truth that what he was doing was wrong. And so the days rolled on. Piece by piece, the Jefferson Initiative team laid out documents, witness statements, transcripts of phone calls, and official communications that pointed to a disturbing pattern of city-led interference in the dissemination of public information. Althea testified again, each time with the same calm clarity, presenting new sets of spreadsheets and logs that reinforced the pattern of missing data or abrupt redactions. Agent Price's appearances became sporadic. Sometimes I'd see him quietly seated in the back of the courtroom, sometimes conversing with the judge's clerk, and sometimes absent entirely. But his mere existence lingered in the minds of everyone who followed the case, especially Sergeant Carraway's. Now and then, I'd watch Carraway glance over his shoulder, almost as if he expected Price to materialize at any moment. Despite Carraway's unease, there were no further attempts to block Althea or the Jefferson Initiative staff, at least not at the courtroom doors. Yet tension seemed to have shifted beyond the building's walls. One evening, as I left late after a particularly long hearing, I noticed Althea standing by her car in the dimly lit courthouse parking lot. A lone figure loomed near her, speaking in hushed tones. My blood chilled until I recognized Harriet's silhouette. They seemed to be in a heated discussion. Worried for Althea's safety, I drew closer to eavesdrop. "I'm telling you, Harriet, I feel like I'm being watched," Althea admitted, her voice trembling. "I'll catch glimpses of people following me home, or a dark SUV parked outside my building. I get phone calls where nobody speaks." Harriet tried to reassure her. "We'll file a report. We'll ask the judge for a statement. And we'll talk to the press if we have to. You're a critical witness. Any intimidation at this stage is a serious matter." Althea nodded, hugging her arms around herself. "Agent Price warned me about this. He said things might escalate. That revelation stunned me. Price's foreknowledge suggested that a bigger narrative was unfolding, one that extended well beyond the immediate case." Althea and Harry eventually drove away, but her words lingered in my mind. "I feel like I'm being watched." Over the next few days, I tried to confirm whether Althea had indeed filed any reports about being stalked. If she did, the details weren't public. She seemed even more reserved, dedicating every spare moment to prepping testimony or scanning newly submitted city records. Her presence in the courtroom remained unwavering, and each day the tension thickened. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. The Jefferson Initiative hammered home the idea that government transparency is not a favor bestowed by authorities, but a right guaranteed by law. Their final words stirred both outrage and hope among onlookers. Outrage at the idea that the city could manipulate or conceal records, and hope that the court would take action. The city's defense was more measured. They pointed out the possibility that the missing documents were due to clerical errors or outdated archiving systems, painting any suggestion of malfeasance as paranoia. They concluded by emphasizing that no clear link could be proven between city leadership and any intimidation tactics. After the final statements, the judge announced she would issue a written verdict within the week. The entire courthouse exhaled with relief. People began filing out, gathering in small knots in the corridors to share predictions. The media scrum was intense. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for quotes, and radio microphones were thrust into the faces of attorneys. I kept my distance, capturing the mood rather than the sound bites. That's when I saw Althea slip out a side door, probably hoping to avoid the crush of reporters. Concerned for her safety, I followed. She was standing alone near a row of hedges that divided the courtyard from the sidewalk. The early evening sky was painted in purples and pinks, a calm backdrop to the turmoil below. She looked weary, as though the fight had cost her more than she'd ever anticipated. Her arms were full of folders and legal pads, so I stepped up to her. "Let me help," I offered, taking a stack from her arms. She managed a faint smile. "Thank you." We walked in silence for a few steps toward the curb where her car was parked. "Do you really think the judge will rule in your favor?" I asked quietly. Althea breathed in, as though steeling herself. "We have evidence, good evidence. But you never know what a court would decide. There's politics, vested interests, and all sorts of influences we can't see." A few more steps passed in silence. Then she seemed to gather her courage for a confession. "I'm worried about what happens next, no matter the outcome. If we win, the city will be forced to release all those records, and that might put certain powerful people in jeopardy. If we lose, it sends a message that they can get away with anything." I nodded, sympathy welling up. "You're doing something brave," I told her softly. "But I understand the fear." We stopped by her car. As she unlocked the trunk to set her files inside, a sudden movement caught my eye. Someone was approaching from the far corner of the lot, a figure wearing plain clothes, moving quickly. Althea froze for a moment, tension rippling through her posture. But the figure came into the streetlight's glow, revealing the crisp lines of a tailored suit. It was Agent Price. His face was unusually grim. "Ms. Robinson, I need a word," he said, his voice low. Althea and I exchanged glances. "What is it?" she asked. Price's eyes flicked around the parking lot, scanning for potential eavesdroppers or threats. Then he leaned in and spoke in a quiet urgency that sent a shiver down my spine. "I have reason to believe that certain individuals connected to the city government are planning to retaliate. They might be trying to discredit you or even press false charges." Althea's hands trembled as she shut the trunk. "False charges," she echoed. He nodded. "That's the rumor. They're searching for anything they can use. Tax discrepancies, traffic tickets, or even a manufactured incident that could taint your credibility and overshadow the court's final ruling. I'm telling you because you need to be prepared. Watch your surroundings, keep your documents secure, and if anything suspicious happens, let me know immediately." An iron weight seemed to settle into my gut. This is bigger than any normal coverage. This is a story about how far some people will go to maintain power. Althea swallowed hard. "Thank you for the warning. But why are you going to such lengths?" A flicker of sincerity softened Price's gaze. "When I took my oath, it was to protect the Constitution and the people of this country. That isn't limited to a single politician or a single building in Washington, D.C. Sometimes it means protecting a researcher whose work could expose wrongdoing." He pressed a small card into her hand. "That's my direct line. Don't hesitate to call." With that, he turned, scanning the perimeter once more before walking away, leaving Althea and me enveloped in the ambient hum of distant traffic. We stood there, quiet, digesting what had just been said. The days that followed were oppressive with uncertainty. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the judge's decision. Speculation ran rampant. Some believed the city would be found negligent, but not necessarily culpable for intentional wrongdoing. Others were certain heads would roll. In that anxious interim, Althea kept a low profile. She stayed mostly indoors, working from Harriet's office rather than her own apartment. She changed up her routes and times. Harriet insisted on providing some security, though they couldn't afford much beyond a single hired guard and some basic precautions like cameras and alarms. But if anyone thought Althea was cowed into silence, they were wrong. Through subtle channels, email statements, phone interviews, and carefully orchestrated press briefings, she continued to advocate for transparency. "The truth," she would say to me, "doesn't rely on how comfortable it makes people. It exists whether we like it or not." On the morning the judge's written verdict was to be announced, the courthouse was a powder keg of emotions. Reporters, activists, and legal teams swarmed the halls. The judge hadn't scheduled a formal hearing for the reading, so we had to wait for an official from the clerk's office to hand out copies of the ruling. Althea arrived with Harriet, surrounded by a small contingent of supporters. I kept close, partly out of professional duty, partly out of concern for her safety. Agent Price, conspicuously absent, was presumably monitoring from somewhere else, or maybe he was handling another matter entirely. Time seemed to move in sluggish waves, each minute heavier than the last. Finally, a clerk stepped into the hallway and pinned a notice on the board. In an instant, the hall erupted as people jostled to read over each other's shoulders. Gasps and exclamations filled the air. Some faces lit with relief. Others fell into shock. The verdict was this. The court found that the city had, indeed, intentionally obstructed access to certain public records, constituting a violation of both state open records laws and federal constitutional guarantees. The city was ordered to release all requested documents in full and to pay damages to the Jefferson Initiative. Additionally, the judge referred the case to the state's attorney general for further investigation into potential criminal conduct by specific city officials. Althea let out a shaky, grateful laugh, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. People around her hugged one another, and Harriet clasped her hand, letting out an exuberant "We did it." Cameras flashed as more journalists arrived to capture the euphoric moment. But as the crowd milled around, some with joy, some in silent fury, I spotted Sergeant Carraway off to the side, glaring at Althea with a look that could slice steel. His fist clenched around the baton at his hip. He didn't approach her. Maybe even he recognized that his time for intimidation was over, that the tide had turned. In the hours that followed, the city's mayor called a press conference, stumbling through a statement that vowed cooperation with the court's order while also denying any personal involvement in wrongdoing. A swirl of speculation about resignations, investigations, and possible federal oversight consumed the local news cycle. Meanwhile, Althea found herself an unlikely symbol of justice, with reporters clamoring for exclusive interviews. But in the midst of it all, she remained humble and a bit overwhelmed, reminding everyone that the real victory was for the community at large, for residents who deserved a government that answered to them, not the other way around. A few days later, I met Althea again by chance. She was in the courthouse parking lot, this time in broad daylight, the sun shining overhead. The tension that once marred her face seemed lighter, replaced by cautious optimism. She waved me over, and I joined her, leaning against the trunk of her car as a gentle breeze ruffled the edge of my notebook. "There's something surreal about all this," she said, gesturing at the courthouse behind us. "The ruling is monumental, but it's just the start of uncovering the truth." I nodded. "Are you worried about retaliation?" She paused, pressing her lips together. "A little, but I've spoken with Agent Price. He assured me there are more people watching my back than I realize." "Do you trust him?" I asked. She tilted her head in thought. "I trust that he believes in the oath he's taken. And that's enough for me right now." For a while, we stood there in companionable silence, letting the sunlight and the relief of a hard-won battle wash over us. I thought back to the very start of this saga, to the morning when Carraway had tried to block Althea from entering the court, the simmering tension in the hallway, and the abrupt arrival of a Secret Service agent who had quietly shifted the narrative. It was all so improbable, so dramatic, that if I hadn't witnessed it firsthand, I might have questioned its authenticity. Yet it was real, and it spoke volumes about the unpredictable collisions of power, prejudice, and justice in our world. And so the story concluded as many viral tales do, not with final note of perfect closure, but with a sense of something bigger continuing on, with ripples spreading outward. Carraway would have to answer for his actions. The city's leadership faced scrutiny, and the possibility of criminal charges hovered in the air. Althea Robinson, the determined researcher who would face intimidation at every turn, found her voice amplified on a national stage. Justice, in some measure, had been served, but the fight for transparency and equality, for a system that treats every person with the respect they deserve, never truly ends. Althea, Harriet, and countless others would keep pushing, keep uncovering hidden truths, and keep demanding better. 2 weeks later, a friend forwarded me an online article from a major news outlet. The headline read, "Local researchers' court victory exposes citywide corruption. Secret Service intervenes to uphold transparency." The story went viral on social media. People shared it with hashtags about justice, accountability, and the courage it sometimes takes just to walk through a courthouse door. The public's reaction was explosive. Some expressed outrage at the systemic corruption, others praised the legal team's perseverance, and many voiced support for Althea, whose image, captured in a single press photo, tears of relief shining in her eyes, became an enduring symbol of citizen-led advocacy. Not all the commentary was positive. Of course, trolls questioned her motives, accused her of staging events for publicity, or hurled thinly veiled racist remarks. But in the grand scheme, those bitter voices were drowned out by an outpouring of solidarity. As for Sergeant Caraway, the department initiated an internal review of his conduct. Rumors surfaced that, behind closed doors, he lashed out at higher-ups, blaming political correctness for his troubles. But outside, in the court of public opinion, few people had patience for his excuses. Videos of him barring Althea from the courthouse, recorded by bystanders, circulated widely on social media, fueling calls for discipline. In one particularly poignant post, a user wrote, "This is not just about one cop. It's about a system that sometimes fails those it's meant to protect. And it's about the people like Althea Robinson who won't let that stand." The user's words echoed the essence of what had happened. A single confrontation in a courthouse hallway revealing a deeper, more pervasive rot, and the unstoppable resilience of those who demand something better. For my part, I continued covering the story, writing feature pieces about legal transparency, the underreported role of researchers like Althea, and the power of public accountability. In every article, I tried to convey the gravity and emotion of that day, of the moment one voice, supported by facts and principle, stood firm against intimidation and was, in turn, quietly reinforced by an unexpected ally. Whenever I reflect on it now, a montage of images floods my mind. The hush in the hallway when Caraway first refused her entry, the almost inaudible footsteps of Agent Price as he approached, the relief and gratitude in Althea's eyes, the unstoppable momentum of truth once it found a stage. In the end, the reason the story went viral wasn't just because of the high drama, the sensational standoff, or the cameo by a Secret Service agent. It was because it touched something profound in the collective psyche, the longing for a society where authority cannot simply snuff out a person's rights because of their skin color, their identity, or their willingness to speak truth to power. People shared it because they were outraged, yes, but also because it gave them hope. Hope that sometimes, when the situation looks darkest, a quiet but formidable force can step in, reminding us that principles matter and that we are not alone in defending them. Hope that a single determined individual can triumph over a system that once seemed insurmountable. Hope that beneath our many flaws, there remain threads of integrity that run through communities and institutions alike. And that's how I'll always remember that day, caught in the swirl of tension and fear, yet illuminated by acts of courage. Through the swirling rumors, the meltdown of corrupt city bureaucracy, and the unstoppable wave of public opinion, one truth blazed through. Real change happens when we confront injustice head-on, stand by those who speak out, and seize the moment to declare, "We can do better than this." Althea didn't set out to become anyone's hero. She just wanted records that belonged in the public domain to see the light of day, and in pursuing that goal, armed with data, patience, and an unshakable moral compass, she became living proof that, often, the most transformative stories begin with something very simple: the refusal to stay silent in the face of what is wrong. A few months later, long after the case had concluded and the city's compliance with the court order was well underway, I ran into Althea again at a local community event. She was speaking to a small audience about the importance of data transparency for civic engagement. I lingered in the back, listening, marveling at how her quiet confidence had flourished. When she finished, we stepped aside to talk. She told me she was working on a new project, investigating environmental violations near low-income neighborhoods. The cycle of advocacy continued. Just then, a familiar figure entered the community center, dressed in civilian clothes but unmistakable in bearing. Agent Price approached the refreshment table. Althea and I exchanged knowing looks. Though the intimidation and legal battles had subsided, it seemed a certain watchful spirit was still in the background, ensuring that no door would be barred, no voice stifled, without consequence. Althea simply smiled. She thanked him once more for his help, and he nodded with quiet humility. In that moment, I realized that while external forms of injustice can appear towering and invincible, the alliances we form in pursuit of truth, the connections between journalists, advocates, principled officials, and everyday citizens can be stronger still. And so ends the story as I recount it here, though it keeps unfolding in countless other ways. In new trials, in incremental policy reforms, in the hearts and minds of people who read about what happened and found themselves moved to act. Cop refuses to let a black woman enter court. Then a Secret Service agent arrives. The headline promised drama and delivered it. Yet the real takeaway is what blossomed afterward. A collective determination to never again let such blatant discrimination and corruption go unchallenged. In the end, the power of that day rested not just in a single confrontation, but in the spark it lit for so many others. Call it hope, call it justice, call it the unstoppable force of truth. But once ignited, it travels far and wide, carried by voices that can no longer be silenced. And that, perhaps, is why people kept sharing, kept commenting, and kept reminding each other of this story, long after the courthouse corridors had emptied and the echoes of those fateful footsteps had faded into history.